Bob Walker and this gentleman, Bob Clark, are now ready with the last hours of President Kennedy from the time he arrived at Carswell Air Force Base yesterday until the present moment. Now, remember, at the end of this, we will have the last statements from Julian Reed, the governor's press secretary, and also a bit of background from WBSU in New Orleans in the form of an audio tape on the gentleman who, as the Dallas Police Department says, looks good, Lee H. Oswald. So let's roll the tape, gentlemen, if you're ready.
We are ready in this tape. First of all, the film gathering outside the Texas Hotel at 8:45 this morning. The president walked bareheaded and no coat through this misty rain into a parking lot across the street from Fort Worth's Hotel, Texas, where some 8,000 people gathered to get him and see him, because so very few, of course, could get inside the hotel this morning.
Was this planned, Bob?
No, this was a speech that had been added to Mr. Kennedy's schedule last night, so the people of Fort Worth would get a chance to hear him. His other speeches were before business and labor groups.
The president, smiling, and walked out to speak this morning. He will be introduced by Vice President Johnson shortly. Very impulsive greeter of people, isn't it, right?
This was the first time today that he pushed toward a crowd to shake hands. This is the sort of thing that gives Ken shivers through the Secret Service, but it's the sort of thing Mr. Kennedy often does, impulsively.
Seemed as if he was always overjoyed at people being happy to see him.
No question, he loved to meet people. He loved to shake hands. He got a kick out of doing this as president.
This is 8:45 this morning, Central Standard Time in Fort Worth. The Vice President enjoying his introduction of President Kennedy, which has just concluded.
It was raining just before Mr. Kennedy stepped across the street. It was raining quite hard and then eased up a bit.
Didn't like to wear a hat at all, of course.
No. After this speech, his next speech, when he went inside the hotel, he was presented with the traditional 10-gallon hat given to visitors of note in Texas. Mr. Kennedy joshed a bit. He said that he didn't put the hat on. He said, "I'll put it on in the White House next Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll get a chance to see it."
Right, and now we will see some of the videotape of the speech at the breakfast at the Texas Hotel this morning. This is the last speech President John F. Kennedy made.
Ladies and gentlemen, I proudly present the President of the United States.
President Kennedy at the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth this morning at about 9 o'clock. The last speech.
An interesting thing here, Bob, if you let me interrupt, Mrs. Kennedy was late coming in, and many of the ladies were disappointed because she wasn't there, and his comment was, well, she always takes a little more time because it takes her longer to get prettier. So,
Yes, the president then followed that by saying that when he was in Paris 2 years ago, he described himself as the man who accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. He said he felt somewhat the same way today in Texas.
Right, those were scenes of the president's last speech.
that was about 9:15 this morning.
Yes, actually, to pin it down, about 9:15 Dallas time this morning.
Anyone?
Now,
Excuse me, go ahead.
our next shots will be at Love Field, where the president speaks at the Texas Hotel, back to Carswell Air Force Base outside Fort Worth. Flew over here in a very short hop at Love Field. There they have just arrived at Love Field. This was about 11:30 this morning, Dallas time, an hour and a half before he was to be pronounced dead. This was where he greeted the official greeters, and then, as Bob Clark mentioned, as he so often loves to do, again broke out of his planned plan and went up to the fence.
The president and Mrs. Kennedy moved together toward the fence, and again, this is the sort of thing that sends shudders and shivers through the Secret Service, but that This is the president's prerogative. Together, they must have shaken at least 100 hands, certainly every hand that was thrust in front of them. They moved down the fence for something like 50 feet. It seemed they just kept going and going at this stage.
Very cordial reception at Love Field. Bob, the crowd breaking into cheers and applause and running back and forth behind the fence to get closer.
It was a very warm reception. Mrs. Kennedy was carrying a bouquet of red roses here and kept them clutched to her as she moved on with the president, shaking hands.
This was to remind you, this was the arrival of President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy and his entourage this morning at about 11:35 or 11:40 at Love Field, and by this time the skies had cleared off. It looked like a beautiful day. It was raining a few minutes before, and everything cleared up for the president.
Mrs. Kennedy was, Mrs. Kennedy was wearing a fuchsia suit, a gay spring pink, a pillbox hat. The president also joshed a bit about Mrs. Kennedy's wardrobe this morning when she showed up for that speech in Fort Worth. He laughed and said, "Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear." Meaning, of course, Lyndon Johnson.
I would like to stay with these just a bit longer because as readily seeing the president and his wife are in such a very happy frame of mind to see these people. The crowd estimated is somewhere near 2,000 people. A good crowd, I think, in that the president was to be on public display, as I mentioned earlier, for a long time in Dallas. And they moved all along that short fence out there, taking a lot of time and saying hello to a lot of people. As you can tell, they disappear behind the masses of people for a while, but finally you will see them emerge and see the crowds of people as they not pass up anyone.
Interesting thing, the day before we were out with the Secret Service people finding out where we could put our mobile cruiser and put our cameras, and the Secret Service man said that President Kennedy definitely would not go beyond this line and that line, and at this moment he was completely forgotten where any line was that he was supposed not to go across, and his wife and a lot of people shaking hands, as he did in Fort Worth. And I think, Bob, you've been following him closer and been on other excursions. He always...
Yes, the president has done this ever since he's been in the White House. He did it, of course, during the 1960 campaign. The interesting fact this morning was that he was accompanied by the First Lady. Today began as the most intensive day of personal campaigning the First Lady has ever put in. Generally, in the 1960 campaign, she remained in the background. She had said that she would campaign frequently with her husband this year, this Texas trip, for her first open campaign efforts in his behalf.
Bob, you were out there. The crowd was wonderful, right?
Yes, the crowd was just tremendous, and as you mentioned, the break in the weather was just tremendous. I was out there at 3 o'clock, so 3.5 hours before he arrived. I ran to the park at about 9:30. Everyone shouted, "Hey, there's a patch of blue." Sure enough, it won, and the skies looked about just beautiful all day. The president parked at left. Right. He's climbing up on shoulders. I mentioned I don't stay right now with this president. Very good. Press there in the president.
This is when it appeared that he had finished shaking hands and then moved back to the fence and started in again.
I think, Bob, because he saw some people down there that were still along the fence, and he really just wanted to, since he had shaken hands with some of the people, he wanted to go along the entire road.
Many of these outstretched hands got handshakes from both the president and the First Lady. She was moving along behind him at this stage and gripping the same hands that had already been thrust at him.
Just a few seconds here, we'll be moving over to the shots of the motorcade.
You see directly behind the president is crowd, one of the veterans of the Secret Service House. But the Secret Service, no Secret Service man can give the president absolute protection in a crowd.
Repeat these Scenes were taken this morning at 11:30 Dallas time at Love Field, when the president arrived from Fort Worth to Dallas just prior to the beginning of the motorcade, which carried him all the way through downtown Dallas to the spot where he was shot dead. I was there and couldn't help but remark how jovial the president and his wife seemed. They were healthy, very tan, almost to the color of peace.
Handshaking went on and on and on, and the president actually held up his departure from the airport for almost 10 minutes because of this impromptu greeting.
Now they were finished handshaking almost. Bar across the bottom of the picture a while ago was made by some telephone booths which had been set up out there, especially for the press. Now they go back into the motorcade. Governor Connolly, there with his hat off. The last word we have from Parkland Hospital is that the governor is progressing satisfactorily. The state government of Texas has been moved to Parkland Hospital for the moment. State affairs of Texas will be there. The government was operated on earlier today. On the motorcade just leaving, First Lady and the President, Governor Connolly and Mrs. Connolly.
This is the celebrated bubble top limousine from the White House fleet. The bubble top is not up today. This automobile was driven out to Texas to be here for the president's visit. See directly behind the president in the other open car, the Secret Service follow car.
I don't see how, I think it's impossible to give protection, isn't it, for traveling like this?
Now we have, yes, and now we have film of the motorcade going out of the Love Field area. Yes. Peter Springs. Four Dallas policemen on duty today. Looking back, the last time that John F. Kennedy was in Dallas was in 1961. Homage to a dying old friend of his, the late Speaker of the House, Sam Hunter.
Mr. Kennedy, it's almost been forgotten in today's critical event, made a telephone call this morning to Jack Garner, the former vice president who celebrated his 95th birthday. We were told as we were riding along here in the procession behind Mr. Kennedy, riding with the Assistant White House Press Secretary, told that Mr. Garner had, in talking with Mr. Kennedy, had said, "God bless you, Mr. President. Don't listen to what they say against you."
I remember I was downtown now and could see down Main Street where they are just spot.
This is Harwood in Maine, where the president turned onto Main Street full of bunting and gala decorations. And people lining the streets right at the noon hour, actually about this time. Now, down to the spot where the president was shot. Yes,
Police officer.
the bullets have just been fired. People hitting the ground. People running.
Bob, you were there.
At this point, you can see the presidential motorcade speeding up. It paused for not more than 3 or 4 seconds just after the shots were fired, and a Secret Service man gave the order to take off immediately for the nearest hospital. The hospital where the president was taken was 3 or 4 miles away. The motorcade moved at a speed of 50 or 60 miles an hour. I was in a car just 3 automobiles behind the president's. We stayed with the motorcade.
Roadblocks immediately set up here, Bob, at this part on Main Street.
There's the hospital now where the president was taken. I was right around the corner and thought, as we have said today a number of times, I thought it was fireworks. I was with Jerry Haynes, one of our men. I said to him, "My God, they shot the president." He said, "No, fireworks." And sure enough, we ran across and looked over the bridge just in time to see the presidential car take off from the bridge. This was Parkland Hospital here.
Dallas
It was
Parkland
only,
Hospital.
Yeah, and the where he was killed was only 4 or 5 blocks here from us.
Yes, that's right. Right downtown. hospital.
The President was taken in the emergency entrance of the hospital, directly across the emergency area of the hospital. Our car stopped some 50 feet behind his.
Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough utter disbelief at this point, because the official announcement of the President's death had been made. By this time, thousands had gathered at Parkland Hospital.
The President died about 15 minutes after arriving at the hospital, less than 25 minutes after he was shot.
He died at 1 o'clock Dallas time.
Doctors told us later that they felt as soon as they examined him that they had no chance to save his life. He never regained consciousness. He never spoke from the time he was shot until he died.
Policemen moving the crowds back away from the emergency door. People's emotions.
I brought the man and his wife over to the station. They did not believe, of course, no one.
Now, this is the announcement being made. The President had died.
This is Wayne Hawks, a veteran member of the White House staff. This is one of the doctors who attended the President.
Just a few moments, we'll have films of the place where the assailant, the building was.
At this news conference, medical briefing, reporters learned for the first time that there was some doubt as to whether Mr. Kennedy had been struck by one or two bullets. Determined finally until the autopsy.
People now grief-stricken outside the hospital upon learning officially that President Kennedy had been shot dead. Disbelief completely broken up. This is the third time in the last 30 years shot at.
Of course, only the first time in over 60 years since 1901 that the President had been assassinated.
These were scenes at Parkland Hospital shortly after 1 o'clock Dallas time. News of the death of President Kennedy flashed to the world. The President's body is in Parkland Hospital at this time these films were taken. Now the body is being moved in this white ambulance.
And I think the emotion shown there.
I think perhaps the most touching event of this tragic day in Dallas came as the heavy bronze casket was being carried from the emergency ward to the...
A web of evidence appears to be closing in on Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old ex-Marine who is the prime and only suspect thus far in the assassination of the President.
Oswald has now been formally charged with murder in the shooting of a Dallas policeman in a theater only 45 minutes after Mr. Kennedy and Governor Connally were shot. The policeman was checking a tip that the assassin had fled into the theater. ABC's Bill Lord, who is at Dallas Police Headquarters, reports that Oswald has admitted being in the building where the fatal shots were fired at the presidential motorcade. But the youthful suspect, who once tried to become a Soviet citizen, still insists he did not fire the shots that killed the president and critically wounded the governor of Texas. Oswald told reporters at police headquarters just an hour ago, "I don't know what this is all about. I didn't do anything." The gun that fired the fatal shots was found on the 6th floor of the building behind some cartons full of school books. The empty shells were found on the 5th floor. There are fingerprints on the weapon used by the assassin, a bolt-action Argentine-made rifle of World War II vintage. As of this moment, police have not said whether the fingerprints are Oswald's.
Thank you. Jay Watson here, the gentleman you just heard from, Bob Clark from ABC in New York, and on his left, your extreme right, Bob Walker, news director of WFAA-TV. We would like now to present the last hours of President Kennedy. So if we will roll the tape, Bob, let's take a look at it.
The last hours of President John F. Kennedy began this morning in a misty, grim day in Fort Worth, a city just 28 miles to the west of Dallas. At 8:45 this morning, President Kennedy walked outside of the hotel, bareheaded as usual and without a coat, into a parking lot across the street from Fort Worth's Hotel, Texas. This was not a planned thing earlier when the president's Texas itinerary was planned, but in response to requests from Democratic leaders in Fort Worth, the president agreed to come out ahead of his regularly scheduled breakfast address, as he did come out and address some 8,000 people. These shots at 8:45 this morning in Fort Worth. The rain stopped about this time, by the way, I believe. Bob Clark.
Yes, it had been raining quite heavily only a few minutes before. This speech was added suddenly to the president's schedule only yesterday evening. The White House announced at that time that Mr. Kennedy wanted to talk to the people of Fort Worth. His other major speech there was to the Chamber of Commerce.
It's interesting, too, right before the president made his speech, he was given a big Texas hat, a pair of cowboy boots, and also Mrs. Kennedy was given a pair of boots. Jim Wright, Fort Worth.
And the vice president being able to introduce the president, which he did. And President Kennedy's remarks outside were brief, but the people responded with warm applause. So happy that the president saw fit to come outside the hotel, since, of course, the hotel dining room where he spoke later has just limited seating capacity. 8,000 people was the estimate crowd.
The president had flown into Fort Worth late last night after a hectic first day on his planned three-day swing through Texas. He had the two speeches scheduled in Fort Worth and then was to move on to Dallas later in the day.
Bob, I think the thing we have coming up next is after the president has moved into the hotel. That was in front of the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth. Now let's see as he moves into and hear a little bit of the speech that he made this morning.
Right, this is the last speech of President John F. Kennedy in the Hotel Texas, made at about 10 or 12 minutes after 9 o'clock this morning. This is the president's entrance.
Ladies and gentlemen, I proudly present the President of the United States.
After this speech, the president was presented with a 10-gallon hat. To the shouts of "Put it on," Mr. Kennedy, who hardly ever wore a hat, joshed back, "I'll put it on in the White House Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll get a chance to see it."
The president talked for about 20 minutes before he went back out to Carswell Air Force Base to catch the plane at Love Field. Bob, you were out at Love Field this morning. Would you carry the narration here?
The president arrived at Love Field at about 11:30 or so, which was fairly much on schedule. The jet bearing the press corps came in first, and now here we are at Love Field. These shots at 11:30 this morning in Dallas, an hour and a half before the president was pronounced dead. A very big crowd, the president breaking away up to the fence, shaking hands with the people gathered along the fence row, giving the press a heyday, and the Secret Service men, I'm sure, a bit of fit at the time.
What was the attitude of the crowd, Bob?
Attitude of the crowd was very good. There were a couple of signs out there in behalf of another presidential candidate, and one just against Mr. Kennedy, but generally the crowd was very jubilant, and this is what really won the crowd over when the president walked up along that long fence, shaking all of their hands. These pictures made about an hour before he was shot.
This is the sort of thing that always gives the Secret Service the jitters, but there's nothing you can do about it when the president wants to shake hands with people. You see just behind Mr. Kennedy, that rather stern-faced fellow is a veteran member of the White House Secret Service detail. The president and Mrs. Kennedy walked along together here, shaking. Together they must have shaken more than 100 hands that were thrust at them over the fence.
I was talking to the Secret Service yesterday when they were outlining where the president would be, and they drew a little line and said he will not cross this line, he will not do that, and right now he is 50 yards over the line toward the crowd. You can see he's right in the middle of the crowd, right above our cameras this morning.
But so obviously pleased, Jay, at the reception and the warm welcome. This is a very gregarious personality. He loves people, as Bob Clark, who has followed him many times, and we all know he constantly did this. He loved to go out to the people that came to see him, and of course when his wife was along, as she was today, she went right along with him. And this the crowd loved, stopping and shaking hands, going all along. And I even chanced at one time this morning out there reading his lips. Thank you very much, he kept saying, thank you very much.
This was probably the First Lady's busiest day of handshaking, at least since the 1960 campaign. And during that campaign, she generally stayed in the background. She came along on this trip to Texas, as you'll recall, announcing at the time that she planned to campaign frequently with her husband next year. This was her first contribution to what was to have been the president's bid for re-election.
The tape you're seeing was made this morning at about 11:35 at Love Field in Dallas when the president arrived here. They're getting into the limousine and ready to start their cavalcade through Dallas.
This is the limousine, of course, that the president was still riding in when he was shot. This is the celebrated bubble top limousine from the White House fleet. It's without the bubble top today because of the pleasant weather.
Directly in front of the president and Mrs. Kennedy are Governor and Mrs. Conley. Governor Conley still in critical condition at Parkland Hospital. He, too, of course, was shot at the same time that the president was shot fatally.
We'll have the latest report on that from his press secretary here in a few minutes, too.
The other open limousine immediately behind the president's car is the Secret Service follow car, so-called. It's filled with Secret Service men who follow the president wherever he goes. Tonight, of course, there's a large detail of Secret Service agents already assigned to guard the new president, Lyndon Johnson.
This is one of the roads here coming out of Love Field. You can see the people even out at the outskirts of town lined there, and the tremendous crowd. In a few moments, we'll be coming down Main Street. That is the freeway coming from Love Field toward downtown Dallas.
Love Field is about 7 miles from downtown Dallas and 7 miles from the point in which the president was assassinated.
This 7-mile route was lined almost solidly with well-wishers, the crowd thickening as it approached the downtown area of Dallas. The one thing that made this such a tragic contrast in Dallas today, this was one of the friendliest crowds the president has met anywhere along the country. There was a striking absence of some of the offensive placards that are often waved at a candidate or a president of the United States as he travels across the country.
Still on the outskirts of town.
Yes, this now coming up to
there's
the junction
Main Street.
Main and Harwood, right? He's on Harwood Avenue now, approaching Main. And the big turn, of course, was at Main in front of the City Hall, all the way down Main Street to the end of the Main Street, which is the courthouse section of town. And on Houston Street to Elm, and on Elm Street was where he met his death.
This is one of the largest crowds that has ever assembled in downtown Dallas.
Now the excitement grows.
Right, this is just seconds after the president was shot. There's an officer with his gun out. People
falling to the ground.
Right. I was right around the corner from that, and I ran over and looked over a little balcony and saw the president's car take off and the officer falling down, the people sprawl on the ground. You were in the cavalcade,
Yes,
right, Bob?
at this point I was riding in a wire service pool car as the pool representative of the television and radio networks, just 3 cars behind the president's limousine. The 3 shots rang out very loudly, very clearly, so loud that it was hardly anyone realized at the time that they were rifle shots or were gun shots. Almost everyone who heard them first thought they were an automobile backfiring.
That's Parkland Hospital well, you were there when they took him in there, weren't you?
We raced to the hospital. Actually, the motorcade paused for not more than 3 or 4 seconds, I don't think, after the shots were fired and after Mr. Kennedy slumped over on the back seat of the car. At this point, the Secret Service agent in charge, sitting in the front seat, gave the terse order over the radio that communicated with other Secret Service cars in the motorcade to speed immediately to the nearest hospital.
Were you there when the president's body arrived?
Our car was just behind the president's as we moved in toward the hospital. We all, of course, leaped out and ran over to the limousine as I arrived right at the side of the limousine. The president and first lady were, this is Senator Yarborough of Texas, who was at the hospital, grief-stricken. I talked with him briefly. He sat sobbing openly in a room inside the hospital. But as we first reached the hospital, the president's body was lying in the back seat of the car, cradled by Mrs. Kennedy. There was a minute or 2 before the stretcher was wheeled out to the side of the limousine, and the president was taken immediately into the emergency ward of the hospital.
And the news reached the ears of the people, and they were stunned.
Crowd's being moved back now. Very shortly you will see shots inside Parkland Hospital. An official announcement from the press secretary and also from a doctor in attendance.
It was almost an hour after the president was shot before the White House announced that he was dead. The president actually lived only about 15 minutes after arriving at the hospital. It took almost 10 minutes to get there. He died roughly 25 minutes after the bullet penetrated his head.
Right after the priest arrived.
This is a doctor at Parkland Hospital who was in attendance at the last moments of the president's life and making the official announcement that the president was dead.
The doctors told us at this time that from the moment they first examined Mr. Kennedy on his arrival at the hospital, they knew there was no hope of saving his life. The president blood was brought in to give the president transfusions during this period of some 15 minutes before he died.
Mrs. Kennedy did not become hysterical?
No, Mrs. Kennedy, throughout this period, both when she went in with her mortally wounded husband and later as she came out walking quietly by the side of the heavy, closed bronze casket, she shed no public tears. She simply walked along by the side of her husband.
And I think this display of emotion in Dallas, Texas, could very well stand for the display of emotions of everybody in the world, not only at that moment, but at this moment.
Of course, by this time, a thorough search was going on in the city.
I grabbed a couple of eyewitnesses to it and brought them back to the studio, and all of the policemen who were around where the building where he was shot were running back toward the railroad tracks, back behind, trying to find out who it was. Complete bedlam there at the site.
Now the mortal remains of the president leaving Parkland Hospital. Mrs. Kennedy is in the hearse. All of the curtains drawn.
The body was taken directly to Dallas Love Airfield. There placed aboard Air Force One, the White House jet plane on which Mr. Kennedy had flown from Washington on this trip.
Excuse me. We have a sound-on-film interview now with one of the ambulance drivers. It lasts a minute or so, so let's run that now.
Aubrey, what brought you to Parkland Hospital in the first place?
We picked up a patient on North Houston there, an epileptic, and took him to Parkland. We was waiting for the patient to be signed in at the time everything took place here.
What happened?
Well, first of all, these two men come running in. One of them had a large, what appeared to be a machine gun, and they was hollering for stretchers and cots and everything, and to me it appeared that there was some lunacy or something, and then immediately after that, the Vice President of the United States came in. He was very pale. Some Secret Service men was walking him in at the time.
And did the President come in?
Yes.
And then what did they do with the President?
They took him on back to one of the trundle rooms in the emergency room there. Before the President come in, the Governor, they brought him in first.
What happened after this?
Well, then the President come in immediately behind him, and after he come in, his wife was behind him, and they took them both of them back to the trundle room at Parkland there.
Can you give us some of the intimate details?
You mean after they brought him in?
Yes.
Well, of course, they run everyone out of the emergency room of the hospital completely on the first floor there, and they told a rider and I to stand by at the rear of our ambulance in case the President or someone had to be removed from the hospital to another hospital. And we stood by there until later on they come out and told us that we would have to help remove the remains into a casket.
Dennis, what happened to the hearse?
We were standing by there. One of the Secret Service men come up and told us that we would have to help putting the President into the casket and getting him to the airport. And at that time, right after he had told us that, well, Mr. O'Neill came up in our 64 Cadillac hearse, and we unloaded and took the casket into where the President was. And before we put the President in his casket, well, the President's wife took her wedding band. It looked to be like her wedding band off of her finger and put it on the President's and kissed his hand. And then he left, and we took him out and put him into the hearse. And one of the Secret Service men, well, about 2 or 3 of them got into the hearse and just drove off and left Mr. O'Neill and the rest of us just standing there.
An interview with the ambulance drivers, and now these next films you will see will be at the Texas School Book Depository, which is the place where the bullet was fired, a place just off Elm Street where the fatal shot was fired that killed the President. As you would imagine, these quarters became swarmed with investigators, Secret Service men.
There's the window there.
The window right there where the fatal bullet was fired.
The fatal shots were apparently fired from a 5th floor window, and that is where the spent shells have been found. Interestingly, the murder weapon itself was found on the 6th floor, which indicated that the assassin ran upstairs in an effort to hide the weapon before leaving the building.
The place, of course, cordoned off with guns drawn, not knowing at this time, of course, where the man was. And, of course, at this time, he very well could have been inside. This occurring just moments after the President was shot here in Dallas today.
These were taken inside of the building. One of our cameramen was in there, and he couldn't get out, and this film was thrown out the window so that we could get it on the air. In fact, he got out a couple of 3 hours later. Of course, the police wouldn't let anyone in. There's a picture of the gun, the officer up on the 6th floor instead of the 5th where the shot was fired, as he told you.
The reporter's pool car in which I was riding was almost directly in front of this building as the shots were fired, and that's why, to us, they sounded so loud that no one thought seriously that they were gunshots.
I thought they were firecrackers.
The President at that stage was some, I would say 250 feet away from the window where the shots must have been fired. The assassin, of course, used a rifle with a telescopic sight.
And, of course, had to be an expert marksman.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
A man who knew what he
was. Now, Bob, I think you know the story on this film, the film of the Texas theater where the man was caught, and also the gun. Would you go ahead?
Yes, Lee Oswald is now in custody of police, of course, 24 years old, and was picked up at the Texas theater right off the downtown area of Dallas. Somebody had reported that a man had gone into the theater with a weapon, and in this ensuing incident here, a Dallas policeman, 38-year-old J.D. Tippett, was shot to death as he was, of course, attempting to apprehend the suspect. And we do expect to hear in about 40 minutes from now a statement from Homicide Captain Will Fritz, the Dallas Police Department, on the disposition of the suspect thus far. He has already been charged, as Bob Clark mentioned earlier, with the murder of the policeman. He has not been charged with the assassination of the president.
He has been. Did you say he had been charged with the assassination, the killing of the policeman?
Yes. Crowds outside the Texas Theater where the suspect was apprehended. And in just a moment, you'll see some action begin to take place.
No, they're going to the theater now, Bob.
There's the
gun and
the weapon that was used to kill the policeman. Some identification, a wallet. Search for some fingerprints by crime lab people. And now all this excitement in here is when the suspect was apprehended and brought out of the theater and was put into a squad car, a little better exposure there, and taken downtown where he still is, right at this moment.
Oswald's home.
Downtown Dallas. Dallas Police Department now, Bob. Excuse me.
Yes. Oswald lives in Fort Worth. There has been no explanation yet of what he was doing in Dallas today, whether he came here specifically for whatever he had in mind.
Once again.
Bob Clark, you were here and in the motorcade as it left Love Field. Could you describe to us what happened?
Yes, I believe we have some more film coming up of the start of the motorcade from the airport. The rather long journey down into downtown Dallas. This was a gay scene throughout the entire distance. This was one of the largest and most enthusiastic, most friendly crowds the president has encountered anywhere in his journeys across the country. There were probably at least 150,000, perhaps as many as 200,000 people along the streets. The crowd's getting heavier as the motorcade entered the downtown area. The president stood up from time to time and waved. The First Lady waved at the crowds. This was a rare appearance of the President and Mrs. Kennedy on a campaign-style trip. The First Lady, you'll recall, had made it known a week or so ago that she had planned to do frequent campaigning with the President during next year's pre-election period.
Next, to introduce the eyewitness account.
Bob, I believe you were here at the scene as we
This is
approached.
this is immediately, just seconds after the president was shot. You saw the policeman draw his gun. I was there and looked over a balcony and saw the people running toward up the grass, lying down, trying to get out of the... nobody knew where the shots were coming from. There was pandemonium. I looked over the little balcony just as the president's car took off around the corner at an excessive rate of speed, and it was complete pandemonium at that moment. Nobody knew. Everybody thought there was firecrackers or something like that.
I was in a pool press car at this stage, just 3 cars behind the presidential limousine and the motorcade. There was pandemonium, but total confusion at this point. Hardly anyone who was more than 30 or 40 feet away from the presidential limousine realized that the president had been shot.
That's at the hospital now, isn't it?
Yes, the motorcade
Yes,
raced on immediately to the hospital. This was a scene at this point. Those of us who were in this pool car leaped out and ran to the side of the limousine. The president lay stretched out on the back seat of his limousine, his head cradled in the lap of the First Lady.
And I'm sure you saw the pictures of the bouquet that Mrs. Kennedy was presented at Love Field in the back seat of the limousine there at Parkland Hospital. Well, how did it happen? who saw it happen. We have some eyewitness reports. ABC's Bill Lord interviewed some people. First, a Dallas policeman. And I...
Question comes up, where did the shooting take place? What was the location? We have some film of that now for you. This is the Texas School Book Depository. The officer crawling into the building. The gun was found, as I understand it, one story up from where the officer crawled in.
Actually, the gun, that would be the 5th floor.
Yes.
Both the gun and the expended shells were found there. It has been well established by this time that the 3 shots were fired from a 5th floor window.
The police still thought there was a possibility, even 45 minutes after the president had been assassinated, that the assassin was still in the building. Therefore, they surrounded it. There were as many policemen there as anywhere else in Dallas.
One of our cameramen in the newsroom, one of the boys, got in the building and couldn't get out, and this film was tossed out of the window. They completely sealed it in. They're searching the building there to see if the man is still there or if the assailant is still there. And the gun was found. Also, particles of food, I think a box of chicken or something like that. So it could have been in there for 1 day, 2, nobody knows. And I guess time will only tell how long he was hiding in the building.
There is still some question tonight whether Mr. Kennedy was struck by 1 or 2 bullets. This is the gun that fired the shots. There have been conflicting reports on whether it's a German make or a gun that was manufactured in Argentina. You see the telescopic sight,
which gave him 4 power magnification.
But the doctors told us at the hospital this afternoon that it was impossible to say from the wounds whether Mr. Kennedy had been hit by only 1 bullet or by 2. Only an autopsy can determine this.
Police officials carefully dusted the gun, but the word was that there were either no prints on the gun or they would not care to comment on it.
I heard just a few moments ago, or in discussion a little earlier, that the president was hit twice, once in the chest and one in the back of the head. Now we're back out to Parkland Hospital, and I think you were out there, Von.
This is back at the hospital, and this was perhaps the most poignant scene of the day when the official announcement that the president was dead. This came at this stage from Wayne Hawks, a veteran member of the White House staff. This is one of the doctors one of the team of 10 doctors who treated the president frantically for some 15 minutes after he arrived at the hospital before his death. The scene again outside the hospital where scores of mourners gathered in small groups. This was repeated within the hospital
and throughout the city, we might add.
I think this pretty well depicts the entire feeling of the nation and the world at this moment.
There was considerable confusion within the hospital at this stage. It was almost an hour after the president was shot before the official announcement that he had been killed.
NBC's taking our
Many of the members of the hospital staff, the doctors and nurses themselves, were uncertain at this stage. The Secret Service was maintaining very tight security.
Now the president's hearse, Bob, moving out.
Yes.
On his way to Love Field. Mrs. Kennedy is inside. The curtains are tightly drawn. And as it leaves Parkland Hospital, carrying him to Air Force One, Texas Congressman Jim Wright of Fort Worth, there is a plane carrying President Lyndon B. Johnson and former President John F. Kennedy back to Washington.
While the concern is about the president, also a policeman was killed in Dallas. Bob, do you have that story? We have a picture of him here.
38-year-old J.D. Tippett was gunned down trying to apprehend Lee Oswald. This man had been cited for bravery before, but today he was shot down while trying to arrest the man in a Texas theater in Fort Worth. In Dallas, rather. Here is the Texas Theater, which is in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. Now the policeman rushing to the scene.
This is where the policeman was shot here in the home, I believe, isn't it, Bob? Or was he shot in the theater?
He was shot at the theater, the best we can gather.
We might add these are exclusive films of the capture of Lee Oswald.
Looking over the weapon that murdered the policeman and checking the wallet taken from the suspect, Oswald, who has been charged. There is the very quick film of the movement of Oswald out of the theater where he was arrested into a squad car for a trip downtown, which was of course, just culminated minutes ago when Oswald was charged with the murder of the late President Kennedy. Now downtown, Dallas Police Department.
Oswald's face was considerably bruised when we saw him later, and this is, according to police, the result of a very heavy scuffle with the police at the theater. Two of the policemen sprained ankles in trying to get the man. He saw them come in and said, "Okay, this is it." And a fight ensued, and of course there were 4 policemen who finally got him.
Right, and now we're going to hear Police Sergeant Jerry Hill describe some of the action that took place with the apprehension of Oswald at the theater. A veteran Police Sergeant Jerry Hill of the Dallas Police Force, who was on hand and who assisted in the capture of him. And we have a film of Hill's description of it himself. We thought we would bring you that next, as well as some scenes. We may repeat that Lee Oswald has been charged now with murder here in Dallas of the late President John F. Kennedy. And he has not signed a statement. He has not admitted to anything, but he has been charged with murder. Henry Wade, the DA in Dallas, said the case will probably be brought to the grand jury by the middle of next week. And now let's hear Sergeant Hill's description of the apprehension of the man charged with the murder of the late president.
That we had of the suspect in Oak Cliff was similar to the description we had and the man we were looking for as the assassin, but at that time we had not been able to connect the two in any way.
The only discrepancy was 2 inches in height, is that correct?
Approximately 2 inches in height was the only discrepancy in the description of the man who killed Officer Tippit and the man who shot the president.
What was the description of that man?
He was described as 5'6" to 5'8", slight build, brown hair, having on a jacket, white shirt, and dark trousers. Actually, the suspect is about 5'10", and had discarded the jacket, which we found in the Oak Cliff area near a funeral home in the 400 block of East